book was already in my hand when I realized I didn't actually need it. I had everything I came for, 2 replacements for a cracked shelf bracket and a bag of wood screws I'd been putting off buying for 3 weeks. The hardware store was on the corner of 5th and Clement, a place I'd been going to since I was 12, because my dad went there and his dad before him. A real hardware store? The kind with narrow aisles and bins you have to dig through, and a guy named Earl, who still kept everything organized in his head instead of a computer. I was on my way out when the book caught my eye on the little table they kept near the register. Local stuff mostly. History of the neighborhood. Somebody's memoir about growing up in the Sunset District. I picked it up without thinking. That was when I saw her. She was 2 people ahead of me in the checkout line, one arm resting on the counter, reading something on her phone with the kind of focus that made the rest of the room irrelevant. Brown hair pulled back, not quite a ponytail, more like she twisted it up and expected it to stay. She wore a dark green jacket over a white shirt, and she had the posture of someone who decided things quickly and didn't second-guess them. I noticed all of this in about 4 seconds, which was more than I usually noticed about anyone in a hardware store on a Tuesday morning. She paid, picked up her bag, and left without looking up. I put the book back. I checked out. I told myself that was the end of it. It wasn't. The thing about living in the same neighborhood your whole life is that you develop a very specific kind of blindness. You stop seeing the places you pass every day. The Vietnamese bakery on Irving that's been there since 1987. The used bookshop with the handwritten signs in the window. The small park with the broken fountain that the city keeps promising to fix. You walk past all of it and you see none of it. I had been walking past Foundry Books for probably 6 years without going inside. The next Saturday, I went inside. I told myself it was because I'd been meaning to. That was partially true. I had a short list on my phone of books I kept meaning to read and never got around to starting. The store was narrow and warm and smelled like old paper and coffee from somewhere in the back. 2 cats were visible from the entrance, one on top of a shelf and one asleep on a chair near the window. A handwritten sign near the poetry section said, "W.E. Jude's books by their curvers. This is honest." I laughed, which I wasn't expecting to do in a bookstore at 10 in the morning. I found one of the books on my list. I found a second one I hadn't heard of, but whose first page made me stop walking. I stood in the fiction aisle for a while, reading, which I think is the only correct way to be in a used bookstore. I was deep into the 2nd chapter when I heard someone say, quietly but clearly, "That one's worth finishing." I looked up. It was her, same green jacket. Different shirt. She was 1 shelf over, half visible through the gap between sections, holding a paperback of her own, and watching me with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. "You've read it?" I asked. "Twice." She tilted her head slightly. "The ending is divisive. I'll warn you now." "Divisive how?" "Either it wrecks you or it doesn't land at all. Depends what you bring to it." She went back to her own browsing before I could think of anything to say. I looked down at the book in my hands. I bought it. Outside, the morning was gray and cold in that specific San Francisco way where the cold is wet without being rain. I stood on the sidewalk for a second, thinking about the fact that I had now crossed paths with the same woman twice in 1 week, in 2 different places, without meaning to either time. I went back the following Saturday. She wasn't there. I went the one after that. Still nothing. I spent 40 minutes looking at books I didn't need and left with a collection of short stories I probably wouldn't read until winter. The woman at the register was named Bet, according to her name tag, and she had the particular warmth of someone who had worked in a bookstore long enough to feel personally responsible for people finding the right book. She recommended something. I bought it. On the 3rd Saturday, I walked in and she was at the back counter, talking to Bet about a book neither of them had in stock, making a case for why it should be ordered. She had the focus of someone who had thought carefully about this before arriving. I pretended to look at something on the shelf nearest the door for longer than any reasonable person needed to read spines. She finished her conversation. She turned around. She saw me. She didn't look surprised. She just looked like something had settled. "You're back," she said. "Good store." She looked at me steadily for a moment. "How was the ending?" I thought about it. "It wrecked me." She almost smiled. "It arrived and then didn't fully commit." "That tracks," she said. I asked if she wanted coffee. "There was a place next door," I said, which was true. I had gotten coffee there before. She looked at me with an expression that was doing several things at once. Then she said, "Sure." Her name was Hazel. Hazel Drummond. She told me like she was handing me something factual that I could do what I wanted with. I told her mine and she nodded once like she was filing it. She was a structural engineer. She said it the way people say things when they're used to the reaction, which is usually either, "Oh," like bridges, or a blank pause while the other person recalibrates. I gave her neither. I asked what she was working on currently. She seemed to appreciate that. I did technical writing for a software company. Instruction manuals, internal documentation, the language that explained complex systems to people who needed to use them without understanding how they worked. She thought about that for a second. "So you translate," she said. "More or less. That's useful." She said it simply, not as a compliment exactly, more like she was sorting information into the correct category. We had coffee for an hour. She asked specific questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. She held her mug with both hands and occasionally looked out the window at the street when she was thinking, like she needed an uncluttered field of view to process things properly. I thought about this later, about how clearly I could picture small things I had only seen once. When we left, she said, "I'll be there next Saturday." She didn't say where. She didn't need to. "If you feel like talking about the short stories." I hadn't mentioned buying short stories. I must have had the bag. "Yeah," I said. "Okay." She walked south on Irving. I watched her go for exactly as long as it would take to seem normal, then headed north. The next 3 Saturdays built themselves around that bookstore the way I hadn't organized anything around a person in years. I would get there around 10. She was usually already there. We had a loose, unspoken agreement about the back corner, where 2 chairs faced each other at a slight angle near a window that let in just enough light to read by. We talked about books and about work and about the city, and sometimes we didn't talk at all, which should have been awkward but wasn't. One Saturday she brought a bag of pastries from a Vietnamese bakery on Irving. She set them on the small table between the chairs like she hadn't given it much thought. I had been going to that bakery since I was 7. I told her so. She glanced at me sideways. "Good taste," she said. I couldn't tell if she meant the bakery or me. I learned things about her in layers. The way you learn a building from the outside in. She kept her work calendar color-coded. Blue for structural deadlines, green for client calls, red for anything that required her to be fully present and not interrupted. She didn't own a television. She kept a list in a small paper notebook of structural failures she found interesting. Not from morbid curiosity, she said, but because every failure was a conversation about what nobody saw coming. She ate lunch at her desk 4 days out of 5 and spent the 5th having lunch alone, somewhere she'd never been before. She said it was the only reliable way to keep from going numb to the city. "What happens if you go numb?" I asked her once. She looked out the window for a second. "You stop building things that matter." I thought about that for longer than the conversation required. Some days she was easier to read than others. On good days, she asked questions and looked at me directly when I answered. On harder days, she was still there but slightly removed, like she was watching herself in the conversation from a careful distance. I didn't push. It seemed like the right call. But I noticed the difference. The Saturday before Thanksgiving, she looked up from the book she was reading and said, out of nothing, "My parents want me to come for the holiday." She paused. "They live in Fresno. Are you going?" She seemed to think about whether she wanted to answer that. Probably not. Fresno's not that far. It's not the distance. She went back to her book. I didn't ask anything else, but I stayed longer than I meant to that morning, until Bet started turning off the overhead lights one by one, the bookseller's equivalent of last call. Outside, the street was cold and the sky had gone the color of old pewter. I buttoned my jacket. Hazel was standing still on the sidewalk, keys in her hand, looking toward the park across the street where the fountain still hadn't been fixed. "You should go," I said. "To Fresno." She looked at me for a second. "Why?" "Because you thought about it enough to mention it." She didn't respond. She looked back at the park. Then she said, quietly, "You're easier to talk to than I expected." "What did you expect?" She almost smiled. Someone who needed the last word. "She went to Fresno. She texted me when she got back, which was the first time we communicated between Saturdays. It said only, 'The pie was good, the conversation less so.' I replied, 'That's usually how it goes.' She sent back a single period, which I decided to take as agreement. By December, I had stopped pretending the bookstore was incidental. I thought about Hazel during the week in the specific way that means something, not constantly, just in the gaps. When I was at my desk writing and a sentence came out right, I thought about how she would evaluate it, lean or sentimental or doing more work than it needed to. When I passed a building with an unusual structural feature, I noticed it, which I had never done before. She was rearranging my perception without being in the room. The first Saturday of December, I walked in and she was already in the back corner. But she wasn't reading. She was sitting with her notebook open on the table and a pen in her hand. And she was looking at the window, not out of it, just at it, like she was solving something. I sat down. She looked at me. "The Embarcadero project got cut," she said. It took me a second to remember. She had mentioned it once, briefly. A pedestrian bridge. Not large, she'd said, but interesting. "I'm sorry," I said. Funding pulled 3 days before the design phase. They said maybe next year. She said it flatly. "It'll be someone else next year." I didn't say anything immediately. With Hazel, silence was sometimes the more honest response. "What was the thing you liked most about it?" I asked. She looked at me like she hadn't expected that particular question. "The sightlines," she said after a moment. "The way you would have seen the water from the middle of the span. There's a specific angle where the bay and the sky would have been almost the same color and the horizon would disappear." She stopped talking. She picked up her pen and put it down again. "Someone will build something like that eventually," I said. "I know." She looked at the table. "I just wanted it to be mine." There was real weight in that. I heard it. I think she heard herself saying it too, because she picked up her book a moment later with a slightly more deliberate motion, like she was closing a door she'd opened by accident. "We didn't talk much more that morning. When I got up to leave, she said, without looking up, 'Same time next week.'" "Same time," I said. Walking home, I thought about the fact that she had let me see something real. Not the part of herself that was decisive and exact and 2 steps ahead, the part that wanted something specific and felt the loss of it. I kept that carefully, the way you carry something that doesn't belong to you but that you've been trusted with. The week before Christmas, I walked into Foundry Books and Bet was behind the counter with a Santa hat on at a slight tilt, and the store had a strand of lights running along the top shelf that made everything look warmer than it was. Hazel was in the back corner. When I came around the shelf, she looked up, and something in her face shifted the way it sometimes did, like a switch that moved from one position to another, very slightly when I arrived. "I brought something," I said. I handed her a book. A small one, used, from a shop downtown I had gone slightly out of my way to find. It was a collection of essays on structural aesthetics, the visual logic of bridges, specifically. I had stood in the aisle for about 10 minutes deciding whether this was the right thing to do. She looked at the cover. Then she opened it to the first page and read for about 30 seconds. Then she looked at me. "Where did you find this?" "Shop on Mission. The guy there didn't know what it was worth." She held it for a moment like she was taking its weight. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly and without the usual edge. Just the words plain. That was somehow the version that got to me. We stayed until the store closed. Outside, the neighborhood was lit up in the way it gets in December. Not lavishly, just enough, strings of white lights in windows and above shop doors. We stood on the sidewalk longer than necessary, neither of us quite moving toward the direction we needed to go. "I'll see you next week," Hazel said. "Yeah." She looked at me for one more second. Then she turned and walked south on Irving, hands in her pockets, and I stood there watching until she rounded the corner. That should have been the start of something obvious. Instead, it was the last normal Saturday for a while. The week between Christmas and New Year, she didn't come. I waited an hour and a half. I bought a book I didn't want and read 4 pages of it without taking anything in. Bet asked if I wanted more coffee. I said yes, mostly for something to do with my hands. New Year's passed. She wasn't there on the first Saturday of January either. I checked my phone more than I wanted to admit. The last message between us was the one about the pie in Fresno, 6 weeks earlier. I thought about sending something. I didn't. It felt like a question that should wait for an answer she hadn't offered yet. By the second week of January, I had started to wonder if I'd misread everything. The weight of all those Saturdays felt different when I was sitting alone in the back corner with her chair empty. The book she'd recommended, the pastries, the way she looked at the window when she was thinking, all of it still vivid in a way that made the absence sharper. On a Thursday afternoon in the third week of January, she texted me, "Are you free Saturday?" I stared at it for longer than it deserved. Then yes, I owe you an explanation. Meet me somewhere that isn't the bookstore. She sent an address. A restaurant in the Mission I'd heard of but never been to. The kind of place with no reservations and good food and tables close enough together that you learn to talk quietly. She was already there when I arrived. Glass of water, hands flat on the table, posture careful in the way that meant she had prepared for this. I sat down. "Hi." "Hi." She looked at me directly. I handled the last few weeks badly. I hadn't been expecting her to lead with that. "You disappeared," I said. "I know." After saying same time next week. "I know." She didn't look away. That was wrong. The waiter came. We ordered without looking at the menu much. When he left, Hazel put both hands on the table again, deliberate. "I'm very good at controlled environments," she said. "Work. Schedules. Knowing where everything fits." She paused. The bookstore started as something I had managed. A place I liked. A routine. "And I showed up in it," I said. "And you showed up in it." She looked down for a second. "At first I told myself it was incidental. Then you kept coming back. Then you brought me the bridge book and I sat with that for a week trying to decide what category it went in." "What category did it go in?" "That's the problem," she said. "It didn't go in one." I looked at her. "My father was methodical," she said. "He planned everything. Every decision, every investment, every relationship. He built a company on that. And when he got sick 3 years ago, everything he had planned stopped working all at once, and he didn't know how to adapt because he had never done anything without a plan." She paused. "I learned from that, maybe too much. So you keep everything structured. I keep everything structured. I keep everything structured, and you were not fitting into the structure. So I—" She stopped. I removed myself instead of dealing with it. I let that sit for a moment. "That's a very engineering solution to an emotional problem," I said. Her expression shifted slightly, something that was almost caught off guard. "It is," she said. "Yes." "Did it work?" "No." "Okay." She looked at me for a second. "You're not going to push? Would pushing help?" "No." "Then no." She reached for her water glass, then set it down without drinking. "I need you to know that the Saturdays were real. Everything I said, everything I brought. None of it was management. I was just afraid of where it was going." "Afraid of what, specifically?" She looked at the table for a moment, then up at me. "Caring about something I hadn't accounted for." That was honest. More honest than I'd been expecting, and Hazel had always been direct. This was different. "I'm not a bridge project," I said. "I know. You can't design the outcome. I know that too." She almost smiled, but it was small and slightly pained. "Structurally speaking, that's terrifying." We ate dinner. The conversation opened back up slowly, the way a room warms when someone finally turns the heat on. She told me more about her father, the facility in Clovis, the visit she made every 6 weeks, the way he had started recognizing her less reliably. I told her about my own family, things I didn't usually get to the second layer of with most people. My brother in Portland, who I talked to once a week out of habit and loved in a way that required very little maintenance. My mother, who had remarried well and lived in Scottsdale and sent care packages at irregular intervals like a very warm and disorganized satellite. Hazel listened to all of it. At one point, she rested her chin in her hand and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Unhurried, not analyzing, just present. Outside, the Mission was loud and lit and cold, in the way January gets in San Francisco when the fog comes down low. We stood near the door while other people pushed past us. "I should have told you sooner," she said, "about what I was doing, or not doing." "Yeah, you deserve that." "Yeah." I looked at her, but I also would have waited. Her face changed a little. "Why?" I thought about the right answer, the honest one, because I knew there was something worth being patient with. She looked at me for a long moment. The street noise continued around us. Then she said, "Come on," and started walking. I fell into step beside her without asking where we were going. We ended up walking for almost an hour, through the Mission and up into Noe Valley, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. She told me about a bridge she'd seen in Portugal, the way it handled the load differently than anything she'd studied, the elegance of a solution that looked like it shouldn't work, but did. I told her about a piece of documentation I'd written that was supposed to take 3 days and took 3 weeks because I couldn't get the logic of it to land simply enough. And when it finally came together, I had sat at my desk for a few minutes just looking at it. "You care about the work," she said. "I think so. I lose track sometimes. That's different from not caring. That's just being in it for a long time." We were on a quiet block by then, houses dark, one streetlight casting a specific kind of yellow. She stopped walking. "I'm not good at this," she said. "At what?" "The part where it matters." She looked at me steadily. "I'm good at everything that comes before. The part where it matters is where I historically make it worse." "You told me the truth tonight," I said. "Eventually." Eventually is something. She stood still for a second, and I could see her deciding something. Then she said, "Walk me home?" "Yes," I said. It was 7 blocks. We didn't talk much. The silence was the easy kind, the kind that had taken most of the fall to earn. Outside her building, she found her keys and held them without unlocking the door. She looked at me. "Saturday," she said. "Same time?" She thought about it. "Earlier," she said. "I know a place that does better coffee than the shop next door. High standard. It's a reasonable standard. Almost a smile. The real kind. I'll text you." "Okay." She unlocked the door. She looked back once before she went inside. I walked home through the quiet streets of the Sunset District, past the Vietnamese bakery that was already dark, past the park with the broken fountain, past the hardware store on the corner of 5th and Clement where none of this had started technically. But where I had picked up a book I didn't need and looked up at exactly the right moment. On Saturday, I got there 20 minutes early. She was already there, sitting at a table by the window of a small coffee place I had walked past 100 times without going in. No laptop, no notebook, just Hazel with her hands around a mug, watching the door. She saw me come in and something settled in her face, the same thing I had noticed that first Saturday back in the bookstore, but larger now and not hidden. I sat down across from her. "Good coffee?" I asked. "Find out," she said. The mug was already waiting on my side of the table. She had ordered for me, black, no sugar, which I hadn't told her, but which was exactly right. I didn't say anything about that. But she saw me notice, and she looked out the window with the particular expression she had when something had gone the way she intended, and she was quietly satisfied about it. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what it always did on a Saturday morning in January, slow and gray and unhurried. The kind of morning that belonged to the people who had chosen to stay in the city rather than leave it. I had grown up in these streets. I knew every corner of them. And still, sitting across from Hazel Drummond with coffee going warm between my hands, the whole place felt like somewhere I was only just beginning to see clearly.